Okay, tonight is patriarchs in the schedule. And again, I'm going to mention this because I got a couple emails over the past week, just sort of by way of reminder. You know, what we're trying to do in the class is to sort of, on one part, assess sort of critical comments, stances, positions, perspectives about, fill in the blank, biblical topic, Old Testament topic, and sort of present ways to approach the topic that will just help you sort of have a better discussion, okay, with people. In other words, let's go back to the creation week, okay? The notion that the universe is billions of years old, or life on Earth is millions of years old, or Earth itself, so on and so forth. If that's true, that invalidates the Genesis account. Again, that is an overclaim, and we talked about how, you actually could read Genesis in such a way that takes the text seriously, that accommodates that idea. Okay, so in that session, the idea was, okay, learn how to sort of stop the critic, in their tracks and say, no, wait a minute. What if I accept your premise and tell you that, again, there's just a different way of looking at the text. We're not making the text say something different. We're making a statement on the basis of the text because maybe something grammatical here, or bringing some other passage into view, or looking at the text just in a totally different way, okay, like Genesis 4, people outside the garden, okay, that are sort of rooted in Christian tradition. Because a lot of the critics, they have no idea. What they're doing is they're shooting at a caricature. They have in their head the way Christians think about X. And it might be something their neighbor said 3 years ago that they just didn't like, okay? And that becomes the Christian position and the way, Christianity looks at things, which is dramatically sort of underinformed. So what we're trying to do is change the discussion into one where you don't have to either embrace the assumption that the person is giving to you, but you also don't have to sort of just run them out of town and say you're nuts, you're an idiot, okay? There's just a better way to have the discussion so that what's important to you, what concerns you, is part of the picture, but you actually go a totally different direction if you just look at things this way. So just to have, the better discussion. Now in this case with patriarchs, I had asked in the video, at least as I recall my own video, which is sometimes a real stab in the dark here. There was sort of fundamentally one thing that I wanted you to sort of figure out about what Kitchen, especially, because Kitchen is our high view of Scripture combatant for this week. I was thinking of, is there a good analogy for Kenneth Kitchen that would be familiar in pop culture? The guy was just the quintessential cranky British Egyptology professor. And it really comes across in his writing. He can be terribly funny, but also just like devastating and just not blink an eye. So Kitchen is sort of going to be our focus tonight. And what he's trying to do just generally is a very specific thing, trying to sort of orient your thinking in one particular trajectory, one particular way, one strategy. And before we get to him, I want to go through a couple slides just sort of as a warm up, and then we might, just jump into, some of the other peripheral stuff. We'll see as we go. Last week, I had this slide on, in our deck, the account A, account B. Okay, account A, the one with, multiple sources that confirm some data point. It includes every perspective, so to speak, but it excludes God and any other supernatural intelligence. In other words, the only thing that's real is the material reality. So you don't even have to have an opinion on the Bible. If you do not accept this, I mean, a Buddhist could look at this and go, well, that third point is just, I don't know about that. That strikes me as incomplete. And so it creates that little bit of a doubt, like, is this really the way we should look at reality if we exclude the spiritual, if it's only material? That's going to come up short somewhere, okay? But of course, Christians, are going to spot that as well. Account B, again, you have data sources that, are perhaps unconfirmed by other sources. They exist by themselves. You have a sole or at least a limited perspective of the writer, but it does include God, okay? It includes this other element of reality. And I ask the question, okay, which one's history? They both have contributions, but they're both not completely satisfying. But the one on the left, account A, is sort of the way we as moderns think about history. This is what history has to be. This is the only thing that we can have and call it history. And then the column on the right doesn't conform to that, and so people shoot at it and say that can't be history. And, we went through a number of examples about how, things can still be true even if they're incomplete. Okay, things can still be true even if you have a limited number of sources and so on and so forth. So we asked questions like, are our modern expectations consistent and reasonable? How much history would we have if we really, took this seriously? Because if you recall from last week, since Ramses in the Kadesh Stela invokes the name of his deity a few times and gives the deity credit for what happens, well, if we weed out that as a historical source because God is a factor, it would be next to impossible, really, to know anything about the Mesopotamians or the Egyptians or the Canaanites or the Hittites or really the Greeks and Romans for that matter, because they're inherently religious, okay? The gods, a supernatural worldview, is part of their reality from the get-go. So the notion that we should exclude documents that assign divine activity to the things that happen in life is unworkable. Okay, it's just unworkable. But yet the vast, academic community will say, oh, we're not going to do that. We don't do that. It's okay. Ramses can have, Amun-Ra, and, we'll just overlook that. Well, then we don't overlook it when it comes to the Bible. Okay, and that's the inconsistency. That's the point of inconsistency. So again, how much history would we really have? Why do we insist on perfection? Is it misguided to judge an ancient document by modern expectations? And I think, we know where we were last week. Now, this takes us into this Miller article about minimalists and maximalists, because minimalists and maximalists are going to sort of dip into this controversy. First, definitions. What is a minimalist? I know I asked this in the video. I'm going to ask you to define this. What is a minimalist? Describe one. By the way, there are people. This might shock a number of you, but in the academy, meaning secular institutions, non-Christian, non-Orthodox Jewish institutions, biblical archaeology is a swear word. Okay? It's a swear word. You don't use biblical, the kind response would be to laugh at you. If it's your professor, you'd probably just get a good dressing down and don't ever use that term again. Why? Because the notion of doing archaeology with the Bible in hand is ruled out mostly by minimalists. Okay, so what is a minimalist?
Raise your hand if you
prep you
have
with
a
that a little bit.
Someone that looks at the Bible as a piece of literature, but if there's archaeological evidence to show that it's true, then okay, I'll take that.
Mm-hmm.
That's my
Yep.
definition.
I mean, that's a good general description of it. You wanted to add?
Well,
Yes, I know you want to add something.
well, it's
You
basic.
prepped me beforehand.
Yeah, but then I found, never mind. So behind this, never mind. It assumes that the biblical story is fiction, as he said, literature, and unless it can be proved with archaeological data.
Yeah.
And my mind went to this idea, it's like in the judicial system, you're guilty until proven innocent. We say we don't believe that, but most of the time it comes across like that.
Yeah, and if you're sitting in an archaeology class, again, that's sort of dominated by minimalist thinking, that's distinctly the way you would feel about it. So a minimalist will look at something in Scripture, as you just said, and say, okay, I need some external point of data, point of evidence to allow me or prompt me to accept this thing in the Bible. Now, if we say it that way, what does that mean about the Bible out of the gate? Right, not only don't they believe it, but it's not even considered a historical source. Okay, I mean, we don't even get to the believe part. Because you could ask yourself, well, why doesn't it, let's just pretend we don't see God on any pages. Is it okay then? Like, is it a historical source? And they do not allow it to stand alone, okay? It must be assisted or verified or validated, or something has to come alongside to give us the assurance that it isn't wrong. Okay, so there is this like hermeneutic of doubt out of the gate, and it's really not even considered a historical source. And if you asked why, you'd get the religious argument. Well, it's God talk. You know, it's produced by a community that had believed something about the deity Yahweh and blah, 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 blah. You know, and that's the point if you're a graduate student, if you say, well, why don't we treat, the Assyrian stuff or the Egyptian stuff that way? You before you ask that question, you have to ask yourself, do you want to graduate? Okay. Okay, just trust me on this. They don't like the inconsistency of that pointed out, but it's everywhere. It's dominant. A maximalist, on the other hand, would be obviously the opposite, but let's characterize the maximalist. And we'll try not to be sort of over the top here, but what's a maximalist? Go ahead. Oh yeah, that's right. I got to get this on the mic here. Up in the front here. A few steps.
Maximalist assumes the Bible story correct unless archaeologists prove that it is not.
Mm-hmm. That's fair. Assume that the scripture is correct unless it's proven otherwise. So the Bible is considered a historical source. Some, and you'll see this. I mean, there's umpteen things I could have had you read for this, but some will create this category sort of like of uber maximalist, that even if something else says it's wrong, it can't be wrong. And then you get into these debates about the maximalist refusing to look at certain points of data rather than trying to harmonize or something like that. So that's where you can sort of get pejorative, and the other side will often do that. So today in biblical archaeology, even all your sort of degree granting institutions, even seminary programs, who have like PhDs in archaeology, there's even a question: do we call it biblical archaeology? Because we want our graduates to be considered real archaeologists. So there's this pressure to kind of play the game, and some play it better than others, and some there are a couple that just say, "Well, forget the game. We're just going to ignore that." But by and large, this is the minimalist school, or at least the sort of the academy generally, has had a lot of influence here. And when we get to Jericho, you're going to sort of see why. The big test case for this was the site of Jericho for many years, and still is. So when we get to that point, you'll see a little bit more about why historically we sort of went from mainstream archaeologists that were believers or not believers, it didn't matter. They still viewed the Old Testament as a legitimate historical source, and then how that changed. Okay, when we get to Jericho, we'll see that. So again, just to put these up here, Minimalist, one cannot present an item from the biblical account as history, again, unless we have support. And the maximalist, you can do that, again, unless it's disproved otherwise. Now we get to Kitchen and Hendel. I'm going to assume that you've read these, but I do want to go through Kitchen's article quickly. And then you had to read Hendel, and then there was a rebuttal by Kitchen, which was vintage Kitchen. Like I said, he could be very funny, but just really brutal at this. Yeah. Now Kitchen, again, would be a maximalist, but he's also sort of in the British tradition. He would not be. This takes us into the whole issue of inerrancy. Okay, the way American evangelicals historically think about inerrancy is not the same way that British and people in other parts of the world think about this topic. So Kitchen is again he's on the British side of things. He's not so much concerned with inerrancy as Americans define it, but he is on the maximalist side. He's retired now. I think he's still alive. But he devoted most of his career to the historical reliability of the Old Testament. Okay, you can still get his books. Some of them are quite lengthy. Others are short paperbacks. But everything Kitchen does is pretty much worth getting. You probably already know, but I'll ask: which date of the Exodus does Kitchen hold to? You have to know this about him. Ramses is a better way to identify it. He believes in what would be the late date of the Exodus. Now, just to prep your reading again for when we get to Jericho, and Exodus is next week, and then Jericho after that. There are fundamentally two dates, two possibilities, or two major positions, let's put it that way, for the date of the Exodus. One is that the Exodus occurred in the 15th century BC, roughly 1446 BC. That number comes from 1 Kings 6:1, which says in the 4th year of Solomon, when he starts building the temple, that happened to be the 480th anniversary of the Exodus from Egypt. So do we know when Solomon reigned? Yeah, 970 BC, with a high degree of assurance, because we have Assyrian records from 1000 BC onward that hook into biblical narrative. So 966 plus 480 going backwards is 1446. What could be simpler? Well, lots of things could be simpler. Okay, so that's the early date. The later date says, no, it's about, let's see, I'm terrible at math. 14, if we put it in the mid-12, let's go with 1246, because that's easy for my tiny math brain to work. So 200 years subsequent, okay? Somewhere in the 1200s, the mid to late 1200s. That's the late date, and that's where Kitchen is at. The reason for that date primarily is Exodus chapter 1, the references to Ramses, and also at the end of Genesis, the district of Ramses, Goshen. Okay. There's no place names in the Delta that get the name of Ramses until Ramses, okay? So this is how the argument goes. So if that's the Pharaoh associated with the bondage in the Exodus, or one of the two, then that pretty much forces our hand, because Ramses wasn't even alive in 1446 BC. So there you go. So Kitchen is late date. Most of your sort of conservative American evangelicals are going to be early date, because we like math, okay? No, it's because it's like a face value reading. Again, what could be simpler? And the other view is like, well, then what about 1 Kings 6:1? Is that an error? Is that 480 years an error? No, it's 12 times 40, so it might have symbolic significance. It might be 12 generations, so, and on and on and on and on it goes, okay? So Kitchen takes the date that would trouble a lot of American evangelicals, but he is your friend. Okay, at the end of the day, he's your friend. You should like him. If you don't like him, he'd probably just go after you. What he does in this article is he goes through and he says, look, he admits, because everybody knows this, nobody's ever dug anything up that says, put here by Avram or Avraham, Abraham the Hebrew. Signature, colophon. Okay, there's nothing like that. Nobody's digging up a house and there's a foundation stone and there's stuff about Abraham in there. It's just not, forget it, wipe it out. So there's no direct evidence of that type for Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You can also include Joseph and Moses and, on through, up until you get into the monarchy, we'll say. There are peripheral characters that you do find, but the big guys you don't. So Kitchen says, he asked a simple question. Does what we are given in the biblical text, do the details of the story, are they consistent with, do they correlate with what we do know about the places and events and historical circumstances of the periods and places in which the events were supposed to have happened? Okay, is there a high degree of correlation? Does the picture work? Even if we don't have evidence of the particular people, does the overall picture work? Okay, and his answer is, yeah. I mean, he's very firm in this. So just real quickly, price of slaves. Anybody remember what his argument is here? Price of slaves without cheating too much. Go ahead. Yeah. He's going to look, okay, here we have Joseph. Here's where he would be according to biblical chronology. We have a number put on Joseph's head, essentially, what he's worth in the slave trade. Does that correlate with the price of slaves that we find in other ancient Near Eastern texts in the same region? Is it a match? Okay. And so he says, yes. He actually produces this chart, which, I think is helpful here. So Kitchen goes through lots of different ancient texts for slave prices, number of shekels, up the left-hand side, and plots them on a graph. And of course, the green is just, ancient Near Eastern stuff. The red is biblical material. And of course, this has a chronological, notation across the top. And so he's just literally aligning the dates with the prices. And he says, look, this is, if Joseph really got sold into slavery, Sinai covenant, the legislation about, slaves and all this stuff, all the way up to Menahem, this is what we do expect the numbers to be, and they are. Okay, so that's his slave price argument. He moves from that to treaties and covenants. He says we can now construct a typology of treaties that allows us to date them by their essential form and structure. Not everybody wrote a treaty the same way in the same period. So Kitchen asks, okay, we can take a look at the biblical covenants. We got a bunch of different ones. And we can put them in their constituent parts. There's a preamble, there's witnesses, there's terms, there's this, that, and the other thing. There's an ordering of these things. Do they, correlate substantially with the way treaties were written at the time in history in these other sources at which these treaties were supposed to be written? And so he produces this chart. And this is his typology of treaties. So we've got third millennium. By the way, third millennium is 2000s, okay, BC. Second millennium is 1000s, okay, BC, because you're going in the reverse direction. So here we have our civilizations across the top. Here we have our eras. Here we have, again, and it's not like, I don't know if he really pointed this out in his article, it's not like there's there's 3 of these from Lagash, or 4, from Mesopotamia. There's lots of these. Dozens, some case hundreds, okay? I mean, the typology is not a stab in the dark. They're consistent patterns. So he says, well, here we are, second millennium BC. This is the thousands. And so we've got the patriarchs here. And, the treaty evidence we have in the same region looks kind of close. So you would think, again, somebody could, that this was correctly patterned. Now, what is a possible problem with this? Where do the patriarchal stories come from? What book of the Bible? Genesis, Exodus. When was that written? Lots of different answers. Right. Ultimately, we can't know everything for sure about when the Pentateuch is written, but okay. What's one option?
Raise your hand if you have a response.
Moses,
What?
okay?
Moses is an option.
So Moses, according to biblical chronology, Moses would have been born in 1525 BC. And, his life is segmented into these 120 or 40 year units and all this stuff. Well, okay. Can we, does that work necessarily? Second millennium BC. Okay, well, it might in some of the examples. Okay, it might be a little too early, but what if Moses didn't write it? What if it's written later? What if it's later, then it's disconnected from this stuff over here? And so then the question is, how would the author have known? What's the answer, or a possible answer? Okay, oral tradition is something I'm hearing. There's also something easier. Something you're more familiar with, at least I'm more familiar with because I grew up in the 70s and 80s. It's called a library. It's a building where they used to put books, and they were on shelves. Okay. So, you guys know enough of the discussion now that, okay, let's say that parts of the Pentateuch were composed during the exile. Well, the exile's in Babylon. Okay, Babylon had libraries. We know this from archaeology. What would they have put in those libraries? Cuneiform texts, because that's what they wrote. In other words, it could have been done. It could have been done. See that, but then you have another issue. Is the writer, therefore, is he picking a style of covenant? Okay, there's two ways to say this. Is he picking a style of the covenant to make it look old? Or, how else would we put it? To reflect the time. So one feels like he's just archaizing. Like if I wrote a novel in the Civil War. I mean, we have enough material in the Civil War. I could do a decent job of making it feel like it's a historical novel of the Civil War. It can sound authentic, but I wrote it in 2020. Okay. I'm just doing a good job at painting the picture. That's one trajectory. The other one is, no, we're going to do this because this is when it happened. This is how it would have looked. Or, back to the oral tradition, we're Jews. Okay? If there's anything we remember, like orally, or somebody wrote down somewhere, it probably would have been the covenant at Sinai. Okay? There's a good bet, that we're going to know that. Either memorize it or have it in other forms. And Abraham is the whole reason we exist. We might be remembering him too. Okay? Good bet. It's probably more important than, like Numbers 5 or something. So it's not, people will try to catch, this and say that it's artificial. It doesn't have to be artificial at all. It's a reasonable assumption to think, again, that they could have certainly known these things or preserved them. And so they do it the right way because it reflects the time period in which these things were going on. Okay, so that whole trajectory, that whole rabbit trail is a little bit of both. Okay, a little bit of, when it was written and all that. But even if it was written later, this part could have been written older. I mean, we just don't know. The bottom line is we can't dice this up and parse it out. So what Kitchen is trying to do, without getting into that whole mess, is say, look, the only thing we do know is what's sitting in front of us. Like we can be pretty sure of that. I can carry it around. Okay, it's called the Torah or the Tanakh. Okay, we know that that's here. And what we have conforms to what the time period would be. And more importantly, it's not wildly different. Okay? Because you'd immediately suspect, that something's going on here if it bore no resemblance at all. Then you'd probably have a bigger problem. What the guy just said, wanted to tease us and I'm going to mess up the covenant here and see if anybody catches it. That doesn't really work that way. So this is his argument from covenants. We go down here, his next category, geopolitical conditions. Here he's looking at Genesis 14. I'm going to come back to this in a moment, but he basically says the geopolitical conditions match the situation in Genesis 14. This is when Abraham, allies himself, with certain groups and so on and so forth. Okay, we'll come back to that in a moment. Let's see, references to Egypt. Again, this is sort of the sweet spot for Kitchen, in the account with the Hyksos. So he's like, everything just checks out. All these facts, again, in your reading, would hardly be known to someone writing in the 6th or 5th centuries. Now, why did he pick that time? Because that's when most minimalists feel the entirety of the story, the entirety of the Torah was written. Nothing existed until the exile. Zero. That's what they want to argue. So he's like, look, somebody doing it at this point, okay, they might have had access in Babylon to Mesopotamian material, but would they really know this much about ancient Egypt? Doesn't seem like, in his view, it doesn't seem to make sense. Everything lines up, again, in the late date. He's a late dater, so this is what he's looking for. Patriarchal names, this is a little odder, but still important. And we'll come back to this one as well in his next treatment. This is pretty arcane, but Kitchen is a linguist too. He says, look, if you look at the patriarchal narratives, lots of the names start with Y. Y-I, Y-A. And that's only true up to a certain point in the biblical story, and then you don't get those much. And he says, funny that Amorite, we know from Amorite, this is how most of the names in Amorite were as well, and that is correlating to the same period here. And you say, well, who cares about the Amorites? Well, let me just see here. I think this is Ezekiel 16. Look at verse 3. Well, I'll just start at the beginning. Again, the word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, make known to Jerusalem her abominations. And say, thus says the Lord God to Jerusalem, your origin and your birth are of the land of the Canaanites. Your father was an Amorite, and your mother was a Hittite. Okay, this is a comment about the geopolitical history of the site of Jerusalem, which David is going to have to conquer. You realize that, don't you? This was originally a pagan site in Canaan. David has to take it from the Jebusites. This is its heritage. It's in Canaan. It's associated with biblical people and stuff, including the conquest, all right? So, Kitchen's observation here is like, again, if you have patriarchs living in Canaan when they're, around this era, this is normal. This is the name you would give them under the influence of Amorite-speaking people. This is your heritage. Again, it's an arcane point, but it's still one important to him. Okay. Social world of the patriarchs, laws of inheritance, again, line up, with other sources. He admits here, by the way, and if you ever get in a discussion online, you want to know this. Erroneous parallels from Newsy regarding teraphim images, sale of birthright, deathbed blessings, sisterhood, etc., have been effectively swept away by the deconstructionist scholars like Thompson and Van Setters, and they're both minimalists. And he's giving them credit for this because they're correct on this point. If you see something in an apologetics website or book that tries to defend the history of the patriarchs, historicity of the patriarchs on the basis of the Newsy documents, ignore it. Okay? Basically everything that used to be considered parallel to the Newsy documents has been destroyed. They're just bad arguments. And so Kitchen knows that because he knows the material, and he says, okay, we got that, but there's other stuff. It's not all about the Newsy documents. There's all this other stuff. And so he goes into some of the other sources and some of the practices. Ancient narratives. This is an interesting take. What about the patriarchal narratives, okay? You get these weird stories in them about angels and deities and miraculous things, and we can't consider that historical. Because it has those things in there, those legendary things, we have to assume that the content of that document is unhistorical. So what he does is he whips out a couple examples and says, look, Tales of the Magicians. This is an Egyptian text. It's got a lot of funky stuff in it, but guess what? All the political figures in it are real. We know that from other sources. So there. Just because you have some of this supernatural stuff going on in the text doesn't mean it's a non-historical source. Again, this is what Kitchen is really good for, because he has a command of the material. Again, given that other ancient Near Eastern peoples preserved accurate information, even in wacky texts. Okay, as long as 1,000 years ago, there's no a priori reason why the early Hebrews couldn't do the same thing. Okay, and, that's the basis of his response. Now, Hendel, I had you read, because Hendel's going to give pushback, and I'm going to go through Kitchen's other article here, because he'll bring up what Hendel says, and then he'll respond to it. This is an interesting comment, because I think we have to be fair to Hendel. Kitchen says, Hendel makes a good case for reading the word Ivrim here as the patriarchal name Avram, although the so-called minimalists would doubtless prefer a possible alternative, Abirim, stallions, since the Egyptian script would also permit this interpretation. So what that means is that Hendel is not the extreme minimalist that others are, and Kitchen is trying to be fair. Other minimalists would try to get away from this as far as they could possibly run. But Hendel doesn't, so it's a point of honesty for him. What I'm trying to get you to see is that minimalist, maximalist, okay, they're over here, but there's a spectrum. Okay, there's a spectrum. You're going to have people all along the way, and it might even depend on the subject. Okay, maybe you might have a minimalist on the patriarchs and a maximalist on Moses or something like that. I mean, there's a variety to it. So we go down here, and Kitchen starts he starts flogging Hendel at this point. He was nice to him first, and he starts flogging him. The slave price is pretty transparent. Hendel says, Joseph was too young for an adult price. And it's like, well, even if he was less than a full adult, 20 shekels is still the going rate, okay? So treaty and covenant. Do I want to make any comments there? He says here, this is an important point. Hendel has seemingly not understood the significance of the difference between a formal treaty text and allusions one gets from a narrative. And what he means by that is this. There's a difference between a treaty text in a document like the Old Testament, okay, the book of Exodus. There's a difference between the covenant, the treaty that's laid out, and then stories about it, or the enactment of the legislation. The enactment and the treaty are two related but different things. So what Hendel's doing is Hendel's appealing to enactments to mar the neatness of the parallels. And Kitchen's saying, no. You don't get away with that. Okay, we're talking about specific text genres here, not ritual ceremonies and acts. We're talking about specific texts. So he more or less catches him on that, which is good. Geopolitical conditions. Now, this is a little denser. Kitchen says, the essential point about Genesis 14 is that the alliance of four kings of the East is of a nature politically foreign. Can I catch this? Catch his wording. The alliance of four kings of the East is of a nature politically foreign to all periods after 2200 BC in Mesopotamia, except one, and that one is the period of maximum disunity in 2000 to 1750 BC. This political reality is not considered by Hendel. At that time, Mesopotamia was a patchwork quilt of states and groups. So what he's saying is, look, to have a circumstance where you have political alliances, what do you need? Tell you what you can't have. You can't have big empires, because then there's no need for alliances. They cover all the turf, okay? So you're looking for a time period when you've got in Mesopotamia, you've got basically the whole area sliced and diced between people groups. And to go to war or defend themselves, they have to make alliances with each other. They got to, come together because they're small. And what he's saying is, look, there's only one period from the text of the time in all these cultures where that picture, where you don't have these big empire level like city-states that have just expanded out and become empires. There's only one period where that's true, and it happens to be the period that overlaps with the patriarchs. So the notion that Abraham, the Genesis 14 story would include this detail, this is the only time it fits. Now, what Hendel does is Hendel focuses on the third dynasty of Ur. Okay, I just used the word dynasty. Okay, you have dynasties when you have empires, okay? So he fixates on that because Abraham comes from Ur of the Chaldees. And so Hendel assumes Ur in southern Babylonia, and he focuses on that. And then he's saying, well, the picture that Kitchen creates doesn't work here because look at, Ur of the Chaldees and Ur the city-state. And Kitchen's like, okay, that's not the Ur we're talking about here. Okay, so it's kind of a bait and switch. And what he does in the response is he had somebody create these diagrams, okay? So this is the one that reflects the geopolitical situation. All of these little, I don't know what you'd call them, segments, pieces, they're all different people groups and populations. There is no empire. As opposed to, okay, something like this, where you've got a big group down here, you got essentially the whole area divided between 3 civilizations, 3 empires. Here you got 3, here you've got like 30, okay? So this is what the drawings are about. And what Kitchen is trying to say is, look, there's only one period where this picture is the same as you get in Genesis 14. References to Egypt, again, you could go back and read that yourself. Basically, he's saying there's a confusion over which was the capital and which was the secondary capital and all that. So he takes Hendel to task there. The patriarchal names, he says here, this name type, the charge is that this name type belongs to no particular period. Hendel's saying, that, you could have these YI or YA names in any period. And if you look at the statistics, again, that Kitchen marshals here, it's like 55% in the other article of the names are in this one period, and there's like 6%, or 2%, in any other. So that's not really an honest, argument. Now, having gone through all that, what is Kitchen trying to do? What is his goal? I've already hinted at it to sort of set this up. How does he want you to think about the patriarchs?
Raise your hand. You have a response?
Anybody?
He wants you to think that the narratives about the patriarchs do reflect historical reality.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to say it a different way? Over here we had some.
It seems like he's saying in lieu of primary evidence, there's secondary sources and multiple secondary sources and contexts which support the conclusion. It doesn't disprove it. If you're looking for archaeology to disprove something, the disproof is certainly not there, and there's more support than anything else.
Right. You used an important term. You used the word context. There's a lot of related material that coincides with not just one, but really all the contexts of the patriarchal period. Names, customs, geopolitical conditions, slave prices. There's any number of points of criteria, okay? Or criteria, I should say. And so Kitchen doesn't want you to think that he's arguing, even though if it was you and him in the room, and he'd say, hey, do you think this is historical? Yeah, he'd say, yeah, sure, but now he's writing, again for the academy. So he has to be a little more careful, or a little more data respective. data respectful maybe is a better way to say it. So he's going to say, none of this proves that everything in the patriarchal narratives happened exactly the way it's written, but it shows that it could have. Okay? So he knows the difference between, I've just dug up Abraham. Okay? There he is. He's kind of light now because, just a skeleton. But we've just dug up Abraham or his house or his wife or whatever. We found the cave of Machpelah and it's got bodies in it. Okay, he knows the difference between that and what he can say from the data. And what he's arguing for is, from the data, this is legitimate to say that everything in the account correlates well to all the contexts of the time period, and all that information is not drawn from the Bible. All that information is drawn from primary source texts of these other civilizations. Now, obviously, there are going to be people who aren't satisfied with that because I want to see the skeleton of Abraham, and even then, like I want to do DNA on it, and I want to see his name written on a molecule or something. Okay. You can never satisfy everyone. So it brings to fore this question of, what is history? What is that? Again, you're led to think about that question and the answer to that question in a certain way as a product of the modern world. We just are. And we are trained either intentionally or just by experience in school or whatever to think that history equals the body of Abraham. Okay? To think that history equals an Akkadian text that mentions Abraham. But we can't count the Bible's mention of Abraham because that's the Bible, and that's not really a historical source, so I need another one. That's how we're trained to think about these things, again, in the academy. And what I'm suggesting to you is that it's really not, in some cases, it's not a workable method, and in other cases, it's self-compromising, it's self-defeating, because if you applied the hermeneutic, like we did last week, to other things, you're going to see its weaknesses. They're going to become a little more transparent. But this is how we're trained to think. So again, a lot of apologetics in this area, you can easily get frustrated by people who want the body of Abraham. I'm not going to believe unless I touch him. Okay, is that a reasonable standard? And you can come up with other. I'm not suggesting you do, but you can come up with other examples. There are missing pharaohs. Okay, there are king lists. We don't have all the bodies of the pharaohs. Do we just erase this guy from history because I don't have the body? Well, we've got a lot of other bodies. Yeah, but we don't have that one. So if that's your standard, let's just take him right off the list. And it works in reverse, too. We have bodies and we don't know who they are. We also have incomplete king lists. Third intermediate period, okay? There's like gaps in the king lists. And you can literally, John, this is again, we don't do biblical chronology here, okay? Because you'll literally read articles that say things like, oh, I think 50 years goes well in here. Like where there's a gap. Oh, okay, that's nice. Why not 55? Why not 60? People just fill in gaps. But that's just part of what you're dealing with. Well, we have to be honest, and you have to get people that you're talking with to be honest about the limitations of not only the data, but also their method. You get them to think about their method and how it works or it doesn't work in other areas. And this is all Kitchen's trying to do. Is it reasonable to draw the conclusion that the Old Testament patriarchal stories tell a story that really could have happened the way it's told? Of course, you get the divine element in there, and then that becomes, that's not something you can put under a microscope. That's, again, something you'd approach philosophically, or the rules of logic and so on and so forth. Or is there such a thing as a God and all that? I get that. But we don't dismiss the stuff from other civilizations that have God talk in them. So let's play fair. Let's play fair. If we can get over that hump, is this a reasonable picture? So I'm hoping, again, in terms of method, you see what he's trying to do here. Now I want to go out. We have a couple minutes left, just in case you thought it was kind of interesting. I threw this in. Sarna's little excursus on Avram the Hebrew. Were you surprised by anything in there? Okay. Here's his line. The term Ivri or Ivrim permits a connotation that is either geographic or gentilic. It's either, look at his examples here. He says Canaanite, Moabite. That's a term that refers to a geographical region, people who live in a region, as opposed to the one down here, Mamre the Amorite. That's an ethnicity. Which one does he argue or suggest is probably the best way? And I'm wording it that way deliberately. Which one is predominantly represented in the Bible? Is Hebrew an ethnic term or a geographical term? How many of you vote ethnic? We've got about half the class. How many of you vote geographical? Nobody. Okay, ethnic wins. We've just determined the answer by counting noses, okay? No, you're correct. He points out that it's mostly an ethnic term. I mean, there are passages that make you wonder. It's just kind of interesting. Biblical reference to Hebrews in the Joseph stories, it's always used in relationship with Egyptians to distinguish them from Egyptians. In the Exodus stories, Hebrew contrasts with Egyptians, makes sense. When you get to Samuel, it's used in opposition to Philistines. And all of these are pre-Davidic, okay? So, predominantly it's an ethnic term, which is the conclusion right here. Then he goes down, and this is a bigger question that you will run into on the internet. Ivri, Ivrim, you look at the transliteration of that, and I realize that we have you may not know Hebrew transliteration, but right here, you've got this backwards parentheses, and then a V or a B, an R, and then a plural, it ends with M. People have noticed for well over a century now that you have backwards, parentheses P, R, M, backwards parentheses P, R. You also get Hapiru, Habiru in some places. And so there's this class of people from antiquity known as the Habiru. Habiru, Hebrew, sounds kind of the same. Okay, what is he saying here? Are they the same? Okay, he and basically everybody else, well, I shouldn't say that. Most everybody else would say no, they're not. The Habiru in the ancient Near East were basically vagabonds, criminals, thieves, drifters, Clint Eastwood, High Plains drifter, there you go, okay? So there are a number of reasons why Habiru do not conform to Hebrew. What might be the case, though, is that the Hebrews, as a semi-nomadic people in different points of their history, were a subset of Habiru. In other words, Habiru could have been a general pejorative term for somebody who doesn't live in the cities, they don't have a settled life, they just steal our cattle, they invade our towns, they burn our village once in a while. They're just a pain in the butt, okay? Right, gypsy, is another pejorative, from the 20th century. I guess it's probably older than that. But that's the same sort of notion. So you have this category of people, and then the Hebrews might be a subset of that in different historical periods, but you can't equate the two. I wanted to throw that in because you'll see that all the time. You will see that all the time to justify things like social justice hermeneutics. Oh, the people of God are just, like they're immigrants, or these characterizations that politicians like to throw at each other. Okay, don't mix politics with biblical stuff. Okay, we don't interpret scripture by the newspapers and by the political parties and their little buzz terms, and don't do that. But you'll see it. You know, you'll also see it by certain individuals who they want to trace the Hebrews and their origins ultimately not to Egypt, but to other places, so that they can say that the Egyptian stories are wrong. Okay? So people have ulterior motives for creating this identification. Just be aware from Sarna's article and the sources he cites and the examples he has that you can't really necessarily conflate those two things. And basically today nobody does, but it's the kind of thing that you'll see in mid to early 20th century kind of discussion. But it's no longer considered a viable idea.